Hey everyone, welcome to another episode of Food, Wine, and Whiskey in Your Own Backyard. I am Rob, your host, and have a great guest on again today. I say again because he's been on the show a few times. We always enjoy having him. John Fodera back on the show. How you doing, John?
I'm all right. How are you today, Rob?
I'm excited because we get to talk about a grape and a wine, or some wines that I've been exploring and drinking a little bit more, and you get to educate me and the listeners all about this region and the wines that come out of this region. So I'm excited about that. Thank you for doing it.
You're welcome. Always a pleasure to be on.
Before we get started, let's remind the listeners where they can find John Fodera and your blog, Tuscan Vines. Kind of let everybody know where they can come check you out and what you're doing.
Yeah, sure. Well, I can see the banner going across the bottom there. There's a little discrepancy there. So the name of the website is Tuscan Vines, but the URL is my name. So it's just
johnfodera.com.
Yep, johnfodera.com.
Gotcha.
And then you can definitely find me on my social media outlets. Definitely Twitter, where I'm fairly active. Facebook as well. I have a Tuscan Vines Facebook page, in addition to my own personal page, where I share content and engage with readers. And I do use Instagram as well, which is just Tuscan Vines. Again, although probably not as active on Instagram as I am on Facebook and Twitter. So that pretty much gets my content out, on top of the website.
And I do want to say that you do great reviews on wines, focusing more in Italy. I don't know, John, have you done any reviews on wines outside of Italy? I know you drink wines from other regions, but do you review those?
No, I mean, I guess I do to an extent. I don't write about them typically on the website. The website is devoted to Italian wine, where I do drink, mostly California Cabernet and Zinfandel. I will do like a social media only review of that sort of thing, because I do have a lot of wineries in California that follow me, and I have been out to wine country a few times. So I have some contacts out there, and I like to do that for them. So yeah, I mostly could be either a Facebook only or a Twitter only review.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
I did want to mention that you also have on your website, which I think is great because I love to cook, and I know you like to cook, but you have all kinds of recipes on there. And, I don't know if these are just your own or if they're ones that you've gotten from other people or passed down from family, but you've got some fantastic recipes that I've used for dinner parties and everything and are big hits. So I just want to make sure people know when they go to your website, not only do they get all this wine, but they get some great recipes for Italian cooking as well.
Yeah. I mean, I do love to cook. I mean, it's definitely part of the culture for the Italian culture. Some of those recipes are clearly things that I've kind of whipped up in my own head, so maybe they're mine. But I mean, most of them are just classics, whether it's pesto or carbonara. But I know you've used my shrimp and beans a couple of times.
Fantastic. Yeah.
There's even there's a beef Wellington, there's a lamb Wellington. So it's just things that I've tried to make, and I don't usually put them up there until I've, done them a few times and I'm comfortable with writing down how they're going to work so that people have a kind of clue about what to expect.
Yeah. Well, today's episode, John, we're going to jump into the region of Piedmont in Piemonte in Italy. This is a region for me. I think about people, we're based here in the States, and I think a lot of my friends and people I know started their wine journey in Napa, in California, Napa or Paso or someplace like that. And I think that kind of evolution, I think first took them probably to Bordeaux and to some areas in France, and then maybe over to Tuscany where you have, the super Tuscans that you hear a lot of people talking about. Are similar to that, with the same type of varietals and things like that. And then that just kind of, I think, leads you into, Barolos and Brunellos and things like that, Chianti. I think this region, for people kind of getting in and starting or in the middle of that wine journey, kind of flies under the radar. If you're a wine person, obviously Nebbiolo. It's one of the great grapes in wine. But if you're exploring the world and trying to find what you like and what you want to explore, I think this kind of flies a little bit under the radar and takes you a little while to kind of find where this is and exactly what it is.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I think I agree with that. I mean, it is a big, region. Piemonte is a fairly large region with a sizable, wine production. There are almost, on average, generally speaking, I think there's something like 1 million cases of Barolo a year produced. I'm just looking to see if I have. Yeah, it's just over 1 million cases a year produced, which is an average of about 3 to 5 years. So that sounds like a lot, but it really isn't. And the reason for it is I think a lot of the Barolo that you see, maybe it isn't the highest quality. And that kind of wine I think is consumed mostly, right in that region of Italy. But the wines that are, much higher quality and, world-class wines that are exported, there's not a lot of them made. And, the vineyards can be very small. And, a lot of times you hear about Barolo being compared to Burgundy, and not in the sense that it's similar to Pinot Noir, because I don't find it that way at all.
And we all know you're a big fan of Pinot.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. and it's like people realize that if they're into Burgundy and are into Pinot Noir, they have, the vineyards in France can be sliced and diced among, 15 or 20 families where they own, a 50 or 10 acre vineyard. It's crazy, the way it's delimited like that. And you do find that in Barolo as well. So it is a little confusing.
Well, let's start by talking about, give people some reference who are listening when we think about the country of Italy, kind of where Piemonte is positioned within the country.
Yeah, so Piedmont or Piemonte is in the northwest region of Italy. So it sits very close to the border of, I guess that would be Austria, if my map brain is treating me well. So
close to Barolo, France as well, right?
Probably on the northwest side, or northwest side. Yep,
fairly close.
So there's not. I'm trying to think. I can't remember what one little tiny province is north of Piemonte, but Piemonte is the furthest northwest province in Italy.
So talking about the grape Nebbiolo, just so people understand, they hear Barolo and they're going to hear Barbaresco. They may hear another name or two. That's not the grape from this region. Those are actually, towns within this region where Nebbiolo is used to make wine from that region. So just so they understand, we're talking about the grape for all these places within Piedmont that we're going to talk about today is Nebbiolo.
Correct. So just like you have, Bordeaux, whether you have a Margaux or a Pauillac, the underlying grapes are Cabernet Franc, Merlot, by law, whatever they happen to be planted in that vineyard. So just like your Brunellos in Italy are going to be Sangiovese, your Barolo, your Barbaresco, by law, 100% Nebbiolo. If they're going to be labeled and bottled under the DOCG rules, they have to be 100% Nebbiolo. So Nebbiolo is the grape. It gets its name from the term nebbia, which in Italian means fog. So the reason that came about is because the grapes, it's a little bit different now with the climate, warming a bit, but the grapes used to be hanging on the vines to maybe the third, fourth week in October every year to get to their optimal ripeness before the harvest. And at that time of the year in Piemonte, the hills are often covered with a lot of fog. So that's how the grape got its name, because the fog used to roll in right around the time that the grapes were maturing. So you have nebbia, and then you get Nebbiolo.
So talk about this a little bit, John. When we hear other grape varietals, whether it be Cabernet in Bordeaux or, even in Chile or Argentina, California, obviously, Pinot Noir in a lot of places, you don't hear Nebbiolo mentioned being grown, in other places a lot.
Right.
I mean, it took me some research to find where it might be kind of grown to see if they can make it work. And it's very small and very limited. Why is that? Why is Nebbiolo so kind of, what is the reason that it has to be grown in this specific area to do well?
Yeah, that is a good point. And I've only had Nebbiolo. Well, I've had two other Nebbiolo that were not from Italy. I had one from California and I had one from Virginia. And neither one, in my recollection, was anything worth drinking or that I would have been happy to pay for. And I think people have tried it. It's just like anything else, whether it's, I've had Sangiovese from California, Primitivo in California. They don't work, in my opinion, because they are just too hot in those regions, and the grapes get almost uncontrollably ripe. Nebbiolo in that sense is a lot like Sangiovese, so it has a lot of benefit from the temperature swings, the diurnal temperatures between daytime and nighttime, where you have, significant swings in the temperature. And that does two things. It allows the grapes to ripen very slowly and evenly, but more importantly, while also retaining their acidity, which, it gives the wine that, freshness and that lift, which allows it to pair well with food, which, in the Italian culture, that is the primary reason for having wine, is to have it alongside with food. Very rarely will you see, if at all, Italian wines being consumed, without something to eat. So that's the biggest reason, I think, in my opinion. I think people have realized that, especially with Barolo. You can find, or I should say Nebbiolo. You can easily find a Sangiovese domestically. California, I've had them for Virginia, but you kind of have to work, I think, to find another Nebbiolo.
Yeah, I when I researched trying to find countries that kind of did it to some degree, the one that stood out the most, surprisingly, was Mexico.
Really?
That is Joe Nebbiolo, which I had no idea. But,
I just wonder where they're getting they're getting those vines. Yeah.
Because Nebbiolo is kind of a late ripening grape, like you said, but it's an early budding grape, right? It buds pretty early.
That's correct too. Yep.
And so having the right, like you were talking about the temperature, but they also use the side of the hills or mountains in their strategic way of making sure the vines are taken care of the right way, right? That they get enough sunlight, but not too much sunlight, to your point about the heat. So, having those elevations there and using them the way they do on the sides of the hills and the mountain slopes is what helps tremendously in making sure that they get the wine the way they want.
No, I agree. In fact, if in order, as part of the production rules for Barolo, there's actually minimum altitude where you can have vineyards planted and produce Barolo. So it's, I think, about 560 or 550, 560 feet is the minimum elevation, up to about 1,800 feet. So, you can imagine, the differences in the temperature swings just between, the minimum and the maximum. But
yeah.
It is. And again, to your point, the best vineyards are south or southwest facing. They get that all day sunshine, and then the cool mornings, and then the later evenings.
So we're going to talk about, obviously we mentioned the king and queen of Nebbiolo, which is Barolo and Barbaresco, and then we'll talk on another one that comes out of that region that I think is a great value wine that does very well. But let's jump into. People are going to, I think if you know a little bit about Barolo, or you've heard a little bit about it, it's this wine that I think people go, I would like to get it, but I've got to find something that's already 15, 20 years old in order to drink it. And we live in a world today with wine drinkers that aren't so patient. They don't want to buy wine to sit on it for 15, 20 years. Barbaresco. Yeah, go ahead.
No, I was going to say that there's two reasons I think for that. And I used to be one of those people that I just did not enjoy, young Barolo. And I used to wait for great vintages, and I used to buy them and put them away, to be at a minimum 10 to 15, if not 20 years old. So I think there's two reasons why you don't quite have to do that anymore in order to, as you said, get Barolo. Number one is the warming climate. When I first got into wine, there were three great vintages in Barolo: 1988, 1989, and then 1985, 1989, and 1990. After 1990, there was not another great vintage until 1996. And then you went to, 98 and then to 2000. Nowadays, you pretty much, have, great years at least every other year. There was 15 and 16, and, now 17 is very good. 2020 is looking to be very good. 2019 was great. So it's easier to find a lot of great wines because the climate is warmer and it's easier to get the grapes ripe. And if they're ripe, you're going to make better wine. That's number one. Number two, I think, and we'll talk about this a bit later, is the changing style of Barolo. Even as much as, I'd say 20 years ago, there was still a real divergence in the styles. And if you go back to the wines of the 90s, the mid 90s, the style was completely tilted to what I call, old school versus the new wave, as what the producers would talk about it as. And we can get into what that means later because it's an important distinction. But I think now, in terms of the style for the wines, producers have found a middle ground, right? So they've the people that were really old school versus new wave are kind of congregating a little bit more toward the center. And when I say the center, what I'm talking about is techniques that they use in winemaking to manage the tannins, because Nebbiolo is a very tannic grape. And if you put it into wood for 4 and 5 and 6 years, it gets blisteringly tannic to the point where it needs 25 years to mellow out. So the maceration times have been shortened. The aging has been shortened. The use of larger barrels as opposed to smaller barrels is increasing. So I think you're getting wines that can be a little bit more approachable. So I think that's the reason, for those two things are the reasons for both of that, where it's a little more optimistic to get a wine that's drinkable sooner rather than later.
So when we say approachable, you're saying if you have a vintage right now that, let's just say, a 16, can you drink it? Would you say, yeah, Barolo at 16, you're going to give it some air, but you can drink it?
Yeah, that would be my suggestion. I think even still, if you've got a really top-notch producer and a 2016 Barolo, which is a great vintage, I wouldn't have a problem enjoying one now, but I would probably decant it for almost 2 hours.
Okay.
And, when I say enjoy it, I think, you're going to get a lot of fruit out of it. You're going to get nice structure out of it, and maybe you'll get a little bit of, ancillary kind of character to it, but you're not going to get some of the, notes that just take 10 or 15 years to develop. Some people want the reduced kind of, fall and autumn leaves that develop in there. They want that leather, and Barolo can sometimes develop the smell of truffles, and that takes years to develop. So, but it depends, and it also depends on who made the wine.
Sure.
If it's a winemaker that's who I know the style is not geared to approachability, then no, I would never open it. But you can find a newer wave producer, or even one that's in the middle stylistically, and you could enjoy it now.
So let me ask you this: when we talk about the 16, using that as an example, And previously we would say, 15, 20, 25 years, you got to wait to get to that point where you would enjoy the characteristics that you were just describing. Is that with the new style of winemaking, is that still the time to maximize those flavors out of that wine? Or do you see that instead of, 15, 20 years now, 9 to 12 years, you can get something out of it like that? Or is it still, it's just more approachable on the front end, but you still have to wait and be patient to get what you truly want out of that wine?
Yeah, I think that's probably true. I think what you see is that the wines are more approachable, they're enjoyable, and they're drinkable younger. But if you really want to get that aspect out of it, that secondary characteristics, the truffles, the earth, the mushrooms, the porcini, the balsamic, it's got to be older. 15 years plus, I would think, is probably the beginning of that window.
Okay, so now that's going to kind of roll us into, people are going to go, what's the difference between Barolo and Barbaresco? Because maybe they've heard people go, well, Barbaresco is a little more approachable than a Barolo. Yep. So why would that be if it's in the same region and the exact same grapes?
Correct. Okay, well, that's good, and that's where we can definitely dig in. So the first thing you want to realize too is these are very, very tiny areas. Okay, so the Barolo zone is only about 6 miles long and probably about 5 miles wide at its largest point. And what you would see on the labels, there are 11 communes or villages that lie within that zone where they can make Barolo and label it with the name of the commune. But really, there are only there are 5 that are really like the standard. So you have a Barolo zone, and you also have a Barolo town. So it's kind of like Napa Valley and the town of Napa. So you have Barolo, La Mora, Castiglione Folletto, Serralunga d'Alba, and Monforte d'Alba. Those 5 communes are the prime production areas for producing Barolo. So Barolo lies a little bit south and west. Well, in terms of comparing Barolo to Barbaresco, right? Like you said, both 100% Nebbiolo. But in comparing the two regions, Barolo is a little bit south and west of Barbaresco, which is north and east. So in different, cases, the elevation is similar, but generally speaking, the wines of Barbaresco are made, further north. So what that does is in Barolo, maybe the wines get a little more, maybe it's a little warmer there. They get a little, more voluptuous, more ripe, more structure to them, especially the tannins. Barolo, I think of as, there was a phrase back in the 1980s, they call it the wine of kings and the king of wines. So I think of Barolo as the king. I think of Barbaresco as the queen. And that's to say that, Barolo is, structured and masculine and robust. Barbaresco, a little bit more elegant, a little more delicate, a little more floral, maybe a little more feminine. So I once told someone, having a young Barolo is like getting hit in the back of the head with a 2x4 twice. And having a Barbaresco, you get hit in the head once. So they're very similar, but they make their same point. Now, there's a lot more Barolo produced than Barbaresco. And I think I really love Barbaresco. And it is more approachable sooner, and I don't think it ages as long or as well as a Barolo. Now, I'm sure a lot of people would disagree with me on that, but in my experience, when I've had some 20-year-old Barbaresco that I just thought, it didn't really make it for me.
Well, let me ask you this. We hear a lot, whether it be in other parts of Old World or even in Napa for that matter, throw a stone and however far you can throw it, walk over there and the soil's different. So how much difference does the soil play in the area where Barbaresco is versus Barolo? Is that a big part of the difference as well?
Oh yeah, for sure. I mean, you have anything, almost anything that you can imagine that they have in Barolo and Barbaresco, where you've got limestone kind of minerals in the soil, you've got sand, you've got clay. In fact, that's one of the main drivers of the differences in the Barolo. So when I mentioned the 5 towns before, even then you can kind of like if you imagine California, how it's kind of divided, loosely between Napa Valley and Sonoma Valley, right? You can kind of divide Barolo, and again, you're talking about 6 miles by 5 miles wide. That's not very big, but you divide it between the Serralunga Valley and the Central Valley. So Serralunga Valley will be home to Castiglione Filetto, Serralunga d'Alba, and Monforte d'Alba, where the soils there have a lot of sand, a lot of limestone, and fossilized minerals. Barolos from the Serralunga Valley can be, more austere, very powerful, and it takes a long time to develop those tertiary, aromas and flavors. Then there's the Central Valley, which includes the communes of Barolo and La Mora. So there, it's a little bit more. The soils are a little bit more based in clay, and that gives you a little bit more perfume, and the tannins are a little bit, texturally smoother, a little bit more velvety. Generally, maybe a little bit more approachable at a younger age than in the other valley. So it really depends. I find that always the case, even in Tuscany, but I think in Barolo, or I should say in Piemonte, when you're talking about Barolo or Barbaresco, I think the variables, altitude, soil, and the style of the winemaker really are almost amplified in the wine at the end of the day.
Well, let me ask you this. You love to cook, and
yep.
I love to cook as well. And we know, I think it's the same here, that, in old world, people made wines. They've been making wines for hundreds of years, and they made their wine to complement whatever resources they had around them as far as what they were eating. And when people think Italian wine, I think most people just think, not most people, that's kind of rude to people, isn't it? A lot of people think pasta, not all of us.
Of course.
Think pasta, but a lot of people that are getting into wine think Italian wine must be pasta. When we think about Piemonte, that's not necessarily the case, but they still styled their wines kind of to go with the food that they like to eat in that region, correct?
Oh, for sure. Absolutely.
And what are those foods?
Well, when I think of Barolo, even with Piemonte, again, what happens I can't say what ripens, or I guess the term would be what's harvested or forested in the autumn in Piemonte when the grapes are ripening, right?
Yeah.
Truffle hunters are everywhere. Porcinis are coming up. So you have 2 pastas in Piemonte. One is called tajarin, which is a long noodle, and another is called agnolotti, which is or plin, Plin, which is a kind of a stuffed pasta, like a ravioli, but it's just like an odd kind of shape. But you could stuff those with cheese and meat. Truffles are everywhere. On top of Piemonte pastas, you've got truffle butter and butter and cream sauces there. Bollito misto is a boiled meat dish. It doesn't sound too.
I was going to say boiled meat.
Yeah, but it actually, I guess it's kind of like almost like a wet braise, if that makes any sense. But risottos with like an ossobuco, and of course grilled steak there too. Those are the kind of wines that you would find, I think, locally being paired with Barolo or Barbaresco. And not to get off on a different tangent, but in Piemonte they also have Dolcetto and Barbera that they grow, and those 2 grapes make wines by the same names, just like Barolo. And those wines are your more everyday wines for the Piedmontese. You know, your pasta with tomato sauce, whatever they may be eating. Those are easier drinking wines, generally speaking, and by and large, that's the workhorse reds of the region, similar to like a Chianti Classico or something like that. You know, you're not drinking Barolo and Barbaresco, you know, every day. That's for special meals and you know, where you have a little bit more time to sit and relax.
Well, let's touch on, before we dive into all the wines we're going to talk about in a little more depth, there is a third wine from Nebbiolo in that region, right, that we can talk about. And I think it's a great value wine as well.
Yeah, it is. You know, I wish I could think of an analogy. The name of the wine is Gattinara. And, you know, I'll be honest, without going back and looking things up, I don't know too much about the soils or the region there or the commune, but there are basically, you know, there are not many producers of Gattinara. And oddly enough, one of the producers of Barolo, the house is named Giacomo Conterno, G. Conterno. He just acquired a Gattinara producer, maybe I think it was 2 years ago. The name of the producer was Nervi, Nervi, top producer in Gattinara. And again, Gattinara, 100% Nebbiolo. And Gattinara is even further north of Barbaresco, further to the north and east. So again, you have a lot of aromatic, floral profiles there. But yeah, Nervi just was at the point where a lot of these older producers are. They had nobody. He had nobody to take over the business, and he knew he was getting ready to step down. So he was able to sell to Giacomo Conterno. Conterno is a top producer of Barolo. So now it's actually, in my mind, it's actually helped, because now I see it's finally being labeled as Conterno Gattinara. It's a lot easier to find than it was very difficult for me to find Nervi in the past. So, and the other one that you've probably seen is Travaglini, right?
Yep.
So they're producer of Gattinara as well. They actually have a very weird bottle. The bottom of the bottle is almost like a rounded square, like a square with the corners sanded round, and the neck of the bottle is sort of off center. So it's a very odd looking bottle. You know, but the old Travaglini, I've had old Travaglinis courtesy of some friends from, you know, the 70s, and it's remarkable that they're still drinkable. You know, they didn't fall apart. But I haven't had a newer vintage of Travaglini Gattinara in a long time.
Very cool. Well, let's dive in, John, to Barbaresco and Barolo, and kind of, you know, making this wine, kind of the rules of this wine, how it's made, how it's aged, how long it's got to be aged. They're both DOCG, right?
That's correct. Yep. Both DOCG. As we've said, both 100% Nebbiolo. So the aging is, you know, it's pretty straightforward, and it's a little bit less than, say, Brunello. So I usually go in terms of years, but I think it's, you know, to be technical. So for a Barolo to be released under Barolo, 38 months of aging at a minimum. It's always up to the, you know, producer's discretion whether they want to go, you know, further, and some do. And of that 38 months, it's got to be a year and a half in barrel.
Okay.
So again, the barrel, it could be anything that, oh, for sure, is what they'll be using. But what you'll see is either Tonneau or Barrique, or you know, massive grande. It's called Grandipati, big barrels. You know, thousands of hectoliters in the capable of aging in a single barrel. And what, again, that does is, you know, the bigger the barrel, in theory at least, the slower the wine will mature. And as the barrels get smaller, people believe that it'll mature faster. So,
does that have anything to do with tannin impact too? The tannins that are coming
well,
out?
I think that's the biggest reason behind it. I mean, you take Barolo, or I should say Nebbiolo, that's already very tannic grape, and you put it in a barrique and you leave it there. It's going to be very, even more tannic, very astringent. It's just going to need a long time to soften that up, and I don't think people are doing that as much anymore. Some of them are, and like I said, I think what we're seeing now is people are using either maybe tonneau, or if they're using barrique, maybe they're using used barrique, or they're using, a combination of barrels. And another thing that producers have started to do is they make more than one Barolo, right? So, for example, Pio Cesare, now he's what I would consider a solid middle of the road producer, and I don't mean quality wise. His wines are great. He uses a very subtle amount of oak in his Barolo. So he has one Barolo that he uses larger barrels for, almost very more traditional, and then he has a Barolo that he calls Ornato, which comes from the single vineyard named Ornato, but he also puts that into barrique. And that wine is a completely, new wave style of Barolo. And he does the same thing. He's one of the few producers that have vineyards in both regions, Barolo and Barbaresco. And he does the same thing with Barbaresco. So he has the white label Barbaresco, which is, right down the middle, large barrels, traditionally made. And then he does a Barbaresco called, I can't remember what the name of it's called. But it's the same way as the Barolo Ornato. So it's a single vineyard Barbaresco, and he uses only barrique for the aging. So, I mean, he's going after both markets there.
You're talking about making the wine, and if you go back a couple of generations of winemakers, typically back then, tell me if I'm wrong, most of the Barolos that were made were blended, and by blended I mean from different vineyards, and they just brought it. And a lot that we see today, it's become more common to see a lot of single vineyard Barolos being released.
Very much so. Yes. And again, that's, nothing is without politics, right? That's based on a lot of, political infighting with the families who think their wine is superior, and they want to have their name on the label. Canubi is a perfect example where whose vineyards are in Canubi and whose are not in Canubi. Some of your more recognizable names are, in the commune of Barolo, you have Brunate, you have Canubi, you have Canubi Boschis, and you have Sarmassa. But some of these vineyards overlap into different communes. For example, Brunate is in Barolo and La Mora. La Mora is home to a great vineyard called Cerrecquio. Then you've got Monpravato, Villero, Faletto. I mean, these are, Busia. They are, major names in Barolo. Where I guess, based on an analogy, it would be like, Stagecoach Vineyard in Napa, or Tocalan, or whatever the vineyard, Daisley Vineyard, things like that people will seek out and pay a premium for. I don't see that. There are a few examples. For example, the Asili Vineyard in Barbaresco. And one of the largest producers of Barbaresco that you can find, at least in the United States, it's actually a large co-op, but they make really great wine. It's called Produttori del Barbaresco. And they own vineyards, or their various growers, I should say, have vineyards in a lot of great Barbaresco crus. And what they do is they have a tan label Barbaresco, simple Barbaresco that they make every year. And if the vintage is good enough, then they go ahead and they make a Barbaresco Reserva from all these single vineyards, and they label them as such. So there, I think there's, I've lost count. I mean, there's got to be, I'd say 7 or 8 of them now. And I don't think we mentioned, just to take a quick step back, when we were talking about the aging. So for Barbaresco, it's a little bit less than Barolo. So that only needs 26 months, where you're talking basically 2 years of minimum aging with 9 months in the barrel. So right now, for example, the Brunello vintage that just was able to be released in this past January was 2017. We already can see 2017 Barolos. They've been out for a while. I think some 2018 Barolos I've seen on shelves, and the Barbarescos are definitely 2018. So, even though they probably are aged a little bit longer for the better examples, they're about a year, generally speaking, a year ahead of what Barolo can be on the market.
Now, you mentioned the classification of Reserva, and we know that in wines in other regions requires some more aging to be able to have that. With Barolo and Barbaresco, what are the aging requirements to be able to call it a Reserva?
Right. So for a Barolo, again, it's 5 years, basically 5 years. I think the discipline is 62 months. And the wood aging is the same. It's still 18 months. And Barbaresco, it's 50 months. So it's a year less, basically. And the wood is the same. So you're talking, basically 5 years, as opposed to 3 to 4, depending on what the producer wants to do. So that really is all that there is. I mean, they may make, a special selection of their fruit. At least I hope they do. Rather than just aging the same fruit for a year longer. But typically I don't see cru wines, labeled as a Reserva. The cru wines are just, basically Barolo. And again, you have, it's funny when you mention that, they used to be blends of grapes from throughout the region. I mean, and that still happens. And probably the oldest, hardest core of the hardcore old guard producers is Bartolo Mascarello. And he just thinks that Barolo is only a Barolo if it's from the region. And he doesn't do any crus. I don't believe he does any Reservas. He puts out one wine every year, and it's called Barolo. That's it.
Really?
Nothing. Yep. And he is, I don't know enough about his wines off the top of my head. They're not that easy to find. His macerations last for months. His wines need, decades to show their best. He extracts every, ounce of tannin out of the grapes, out of the skins of those grapes. And he's about probably the oldest school that you could come across.
Well, talk about that a little bit. You're talking about how tannic these grapes are. And I think, John, tell me if I'm wrong, that's a reason these winemakers don't want a lot of oak to touch these wines, because one, they don't want the influence of the oak and those flavors, because they really like the flavors that the grape has already. And they don't need a tremendous amount of tannin to get, that help from the barrel. So it's really just not necessary a whole bunch.
No, I completely agree with you. And that's the mindset of an older style producer. Barolo, I've had producers tell me, why do I want to take my Nebbiolo and stick it in a barrique and have it come out, smelling like, roasted nuts, caramel, and vanilla, like it could be made anywhere else in the world. I want my Barolo to be from Piemonte. I put it in the largest barrel I can, so I get the most neutral aspect from the wood, and it doesn't need the tannins. And again, that's the difference in the style. And you can find a wine, you can find a Barolo. I'll give you an example, and it isn't necessarily bad wine. In fact, lots of times I enjoy it. You could take an old school Barolo from, say, Mascarello, Bartolo Mascarello, not Giovanni Mascarello, and the wine will be, even when it's young, it'll look like it's older. So it'll be like a ruby red, maybe have a faint orange, hue at the edge of the bowl in the glass. And then I've had a Barolo from a producer called Peruso, was actually a Canubi Peruso rather. And then when that wine was young, a year or so after release, you pour it in the decanter and it's almost black.
Wow.
So the color is fixed from the barrique. It really it keeps that level of color in the skins, as opposed to the huge barrel where the wine is slowly, oxidating before it's released. So it definitely is a huge impact. And I've had, Peruso's wines, they're well made. They can be really oaky and woody and tannic when they're young. I mean, they need, time to come around, or they have that almost charred aspect to them. That if you're going to enjoy them young, you got to have some robust food, a charred steak, and you got to decant them. Otherwise, it just to me, it's kind of a waste of time, because you're not getting the best of what Barolo can offer when it's that young.
Okay, so what's your opinion? I've got one here. I'm going to open up here pretty soon. It's a 96. So
okay, great year.
Doesn't need to be decanted.
I can't see what's the producer? That's a Barolo? Yeah, it's hard to read. La Rosa? Oh no, with a Barolo, I can't see it. The producer's name is in the gold letters?
Yeah, it's Fontana Frida.
Oh, Fontana Frida. Yeah, they're a good house. Yeah, I think no, I don't know that you would need to decant that. I mean, you might want to decant it if it has sediment in it, which I probably expect it will.
Yeah. You don't need to aerate it. Enjoy it changing in the glass.
Yeah, I think that's okay.
Okay.
I would agree with that. Definitely.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to opening that one up and seeing how it is. When we started talking about this region, John, you mentioned a lot of people think of, these great wines like Burgundy, like Nebbiolo, but it's also those two regions specifically. They're kind of I don't want to say they're linked, but they're similar in a lot of ways. One being the type of thin-skinned grape and, the ageability of these wines and things like that, but also the way that the vineyards are parceled are pretty similar as well.
Yeah, that's, I think, to me, has always been the biggest comparison. And for example, Canubi, the Canubi vineyard is one of the best vineyards in Barolo, if not the world. And I don't even know, kind of off the top of my head. Let's see if I can Google it while we're on the phone, but I can't even begin to tell you how many producers own a part of Canubi. And some of them actually lease parcels of the vineyard, and it's crazy. I mean, I would have to guess it's got to be close to a dozen. Oh, I'm seeing it here. Hey, look at this. I actually wrote an article about it from 2017. I can put it out later as part of your promotion for the call.
Yeah, that'd be great.
But this is telling me that there are 11 families that own the vineyard. So, Damilano is one of them. I mean, it just, they own 2 hectares of the vineyard. I remember a few years ago, I think it was James Suckling actually did some kind of video tribute to the Canubi vineyard. And he had some pretty cool videos that he shot within the vineyard itself. So, I mean, the vineyard, Canubi's 84 acres. So that is very small. I know a friend of mine had a farm, or a friend of my father's had a farm when I was a boy we used to go to, and that farm was 220 acres. And it sounds like a lot, but you could walk, within 15 minutes, you can walk across, 220 acres. It's not a very big piece of land. So you can imagine, 84, it's about a third of the size, and you have 11 different families that are farming it to make wine.
Yeah, that's
And that's just Canubi. I can think, Sarmassa, I know Brezza, and I know Marchese di Barolo. Both make Barolos from Sarmassa. Michele Chiarlo does. He makes a Cerrequio Barolo from the Cerrequio vineyard. There's so many examples that are like that.
What about Langhi Nebbiolo? Do you drink this? Do you like this wine from Langhi?
Sometimes, I would. So the Langhe Nebbiolo is just, Nebbiolo grown in the Langhe, which is a Langhe. How do I describe that? It's like it's the area of Piedmont where the Langhe Hills, where you have all of these towns that I described from Barolo and Barbaresco. So the grapes can be grown anywhere in there.
Okay.
But they usually don't come from Barolo or Barbaresco, because then they would be labeled as such because the producer could sell them for more. Or it could just be a younger vineyard where he doesn't think it's good enough for that name, and he produces just a Langhe Nebbiolo. So by and large, I would expect that it's Nebbiolo grown outside of one of those two regions, and it can be good. It's producer driven. They are much more simplistic, in comparison to a Barolo or Barbaresco, and may or may not be as long lived.
And the reason I wanted to ask the question was, people who might be listening to this who've never tried Nebbiolo, is that a wine that is worth them trying? Or would it be your recommendation that, hey, leapfrog that baby to get a real idea of what Nebbiolo is? Barbaresco and Barolo is really where you want to start. And then the follow-up to that would be, what are we looking at as far as an entry-level cost for a quality Barbaresco or Nebbiolo?
Yeah,
or Barolo,
I think, I think if it sounds, judgmental, I guess, but unless I stumbled across a Langhe Nebbiolo from a producer that I really liked or knew was a solid producer from a good vintage, I probably wouldn't bother with it. Just in my experience, they're just not that interesting, and they're not bargains. That's the other problem. They're probably $25 to $30. So having said that, I know for a fact, in several shops, near my home, you can probably find an entry-level Barolo for $35 to $40. One of the producers that does a really nice job at that price point is Odero, Oddero. Maria Odero makes wonderful wines. I mean, she makes fabulous cru Barolos and a couple of great Barolo Reservas, but her entry-level Barolo, I think, is probably $38 or $39. And I mean, that is what I would suggest someone to look for. Perfect example. One of the shops near me has Da Milano Barolo. I actually just wrote an article about it on my website. Well, not even a couple of weeks ago, I don't think. And that wine is available right now in the market. It's from 2016. It's $39. And, the name of the wine is Le Cinque Vigne. So it's, the 5 vineyards. So this producer has vineyard ownership in several the key, classic Barolo areas. But what they do is they make, if the fruit that they have from those crus isn't up to their standards to go into the cru, because they have Brunate, they have Canubi, I think they have Cerrequio. They put it into this fifth wine. It's a fifth Barolo because they have four other crus, and they call it Le Cinque Vigne, which is kind of what you alluded to before when you said, a lot of them used to blend.
Sure.
And that wine is gorgeous, and I tasted it for a friend because he was asking me about it, and he wanted to get my thoughts on it. And to your point, I thought it was going to be too young, so I really didn't want to open it, so I Coravined it. And it was gorgeous. And it was certainly, young, but definitely no rush to drink it, even though it was, a blended Barolo, quote unquote. But a top producer, a top vintage. So I think I got maybe 3/4 of the bottle still in my cellar, that I'm going to see what happens to it. But again, you can find these values, $40, and it's, already 6 years old. I mean, you could easily spend $400 on a bottle of Barolo if you wanted to. So
let me ask you this. Barbaresco, is it similarly priced, or is it like just a notch down as far as cost? And with listeners who are wanting to explore both of these, styles of wine of Nebbiolo, is it fair for them to assume if they find a producer they like that makes Barbaresco, that producer may also, or should also, more than likely, make Barolo, and vice versa? If you make Barolo, you may probably make Barbaresco? Or is that more uncommon than I think it might be?
No, I don't think that's very common at all.
Okay.
It does happen. I'm trying to think. Two producers that I know right off the top of my head is Bruno Giacosa. He makes Barolo and he makes Barbaresco. His Barbarescos are probably among the best that there are. Pio Cesare, who I mentioned before, makes Barolo and Barbaresco. Prunotto, which is now owned by Antinori, makes both Barolo and Barbaresco. But in addition to those three, then you've got Marchese di Grezi. He makes Barbaresco. I don't believe he makes Barolo. Produttori del Barbaresco make Barbaresco. They don't make Barolo. Even Angelo Gaia, right? He was the poster boy for the new wave.
Yeah.
As opposed to Bartolo Mascarello. He made his fame with his three world famous crus, which used to be Barbaresco, which he kind of left that discipline and doesn't label them as such anymore. He does make a Barolo, but his fame was really based on those Barbaresco. So I don't think it's as common as one might imagine. But I think if you have the chance, if you have the availability to find Pio Cesare's wines, I think the Pio Cesare Barolo, just the white label Barolo and the white label Barbaresco, you could probably buy both bottles for under $100. And then you could get a good, if they're from the same vintage, I would suggest that you can get a good experience for how that grape behaves in two different areas. And again, he stylistically wise kind of treats them the same, even though they're from different DOCG areas. But that would give a pretty good education as to how the grapes differentiate themselves.
So the producers that you mentioned, are they ones that are distributed pretty well in the United States that, people can write those names down and in most major markets should be able to find those wines?
Yeah, I think definitely for sure. I think Giacosa, you can find his wines. Definitely Produttori del Barbaresco. I would think Pio Cesare as well. Odero has pretty good distribution.
And then go to
Marchese di Barolo and Michele Chiarlo both have very good distribution.
Do you talk about that on your reviews when you review wines on your? I don't remember if I've read that or not. That you talk about the distribution.
Yes, sometimes I do. Sometimes I do, especially if it's fairly priced, and it's easy to find.
Because you put a great link on there, find this wine, which I always enjoy. So you even if you can't get it locally where you can go down and pick up the bottle, you put a hyperlink in your articles that I think will help people go. I mean, I'm pretty lucky that I can find most of them locally, but I think that link will help them find it online and be able to order that wine. Isn't that what it does?
Yep, exactly.
Okay.
I mean, I do that. Every one of my reviews has that. It's either to a local retailer who I partner with, who ships nationwide for the most part. There's still some states that won't allow it.
Texas.
Or it links to Wine Searcher, but that's there's no difference there really. I mean, because they're all playing by the same rules, archaic rules, as it were. But yeah, no, I do try to bring that value. I mean, anybody can, I can review Barolo Monprivato from, Mascarello, and, it's I don't even know what it costs anymore, probably $275, $300 a bottle. And I can say, hey, this is great, but, it's super expensive, and it's, it's probably not hard to find, but it's not, you can't just walk into a wine shop. I can't do it around here and hope to find a bottle of Monprivato. But I can probably go in, and find, Paolo Scavino. He's another great producer, or Peruso, or, maybe Sandrone. His wines are beautiful. So it just depends. I mean, Pio Cesare should be everywhere. Michele Chiarlo should be everywhere. Marchese di Barolo should be everywhere. And like you said, a major, city. I mean, I think you would find those wines.
Okay, well, John, man, this has been a fun conversation. I appreciate you always coming on, and every time we chat, I learn something new about wine, and that's what I enjoy, and I hope that's what the listeners get out of this as well. So thank you for coming on and doing the show again.
Same for me. Always a pleasure, and thank you for asking.
Now we've got to find another Italian wine to talk about. I'm sure we will.
Oh, there's lots.
Yeah. Well, thanks everybody for listening to this episode of Food, Wine, and Whiskey in Your Own Backyard. And until our next episode, enjoy your next pour.